When I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. Thus saith Saul of Tarsus, a former persecutor of Christian folks turned spammer of Christian churches, in his first epistle to the church at Corinth, 13th chapter and the 11th verse. May the Lord add a blessing to the reading and hearing of his holy word. Surprisingly, as late as August 2020, just 5 months after the pandemic declaration, according to the Pew Research Center, as many as 1/3 of Americans who had regularly attended church services had reported that they were still attending in-person worship. Over 40% of those who had resisted the government, public official, health guidance were surprisingly not Black Protestants, who many officials, even at Christianity Today, had feared would be the most resistant against these sweeping mandates, having been acknowledged by Pew Research Center in 2019 as perhaps the most deeply devoted to religious faith, even at a time when nationwide religious faith had experienced a sharp decline of 12% over the prior decade. True social justice Black Protestant clergy had answered a Macedonian call to spread the gospel of Black Lives Matter after the death of George Floyd. True social justice Black Protestant leaders had taken up a call to march in a pandemic for various causes, including removing Confederate monuments, and even taking the lead in encouraging minority communities to take the COVID-19 vaccines, even imposing mandates for in-person worship, albeit primarily the Janssen vaccine, which had never been approved by the FDA, and which eventually had its emergency use authorization revoked. And yet, according to the Richmond Times-Dispatch, the impact of the global public health crisis had become painfully apparent in Richmond, where more than 80% of coronavirus cases had been Black or Latino, noting particularly that Latinos had nearly 3 times the number of cases than white Richmonders, despite being only 7% of that city's population, a pattern replicated across the nation, while Richmonders accounted for more than 60% of that city's death. And, intriguingly, despite their deep devotion to religion, Black churches were amongst the last to return to in-person worship, terrified of a novel coronavirus bigger than their God. Richmond Councilman Reverend Mike Jones, pastor of the Village of Faith Ministries in Richmond, had defended his choice to close his church, saying that he could have folks singing at home just as well as making a joyful noise in the sanctuary. But they'll be safer at home. According to Reverend Jones, it did not matter whether we are connecting through social media and live streaming or whether we're in an exact space. Similarly, Reverend Howard John Wesley, senior pastor of the historic Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, had told the religious news service, every church has to make a decision on where they believe the line of safety is, and, at least in his mind, a former magna cum laude graduate of Duke University majoring in biomedical engineering. In his mind, one member contracting COVID on the grounds of Albert Street would be more than we believe. We believe glorifies God. Yet surprisingly, while some began to stand for the Negro National Anthem at sporting events in a pandemic, learning the melodic words about a prayer for strength lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee. Lest their hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. It was not even the son of a Pentecostal preacher who had assumed the pulpit in Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta before gaining a seat in the Senate, but rather counted amongst the most religiously devoted in pandemic, at least in in-person worship, continuing to attend, were white evangelical Protestants and white Roman Catholics. And in Virginia, from where the foundations for the First Amendment freedoms to exercise religious devotion and prohibitions against an established religion had been born, the entire nation watched headlines broadcasted on ABC News about a Virginia bishop who had ignored social distancing guidelines and had apparently, as a result, died from COVID-19. Perhaps even in science, the wages of sin are death. According to the ABC News report, Bishop Gerald Glenn, the pastor of the New Deliverance Evangelistic Church in Virginia, had died. According to a church announcement on Easter Sunday, Bishop Glenn, a black Pentecostal, had tested positive for coronavirus, according to a video posted by his daughter, Marie Jerry Crawley. And his death was joined by at least 30 other black Pentecostal faith leaders before the first Easter in pandemic. This news probably comes as no surprise to most, because by the first anniversary of the pandemic, the Atlantic and Boston University had reported that the COVID-19 pandemic had been adversely affecting black, indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color the most. Nationwide, black people had experienced a case fatality rate 1.4 times the rate of white people, and by the first anniversary of the pandemic declaration, when, according to the president, the nationwide fatalities had exceeded the deaths of American service members in both world wars and the conflict in Southeast Asia, as well as the lives lost on 9/11. The nation had lost at least 73,462 black lives to COVID-19 to that day, representing approximately 15% of COVID-19 deaths where race was known. Yet 1/3 of Americans with religious faith had continued their attendance at religious devotional services, and this proportion of Americans is about equivalent to the number of Americans, while tending to be less educated by credential and awarded degrees, who had believed that a novel coronavirus had not set off a global pandemic crisis, but had rather come from a laboratory in a manner not agreed upon by the most trusted voice for separating fact from fiction, who had believed that the most likely scenario was a natural spillover from an animal reservoir to a human. On the first anniversary of the pandemic declaration, even the president had acknowledged that we were hit with a virus that was met with silence and spread unchecked. Denials for days, weeks, then months that led to more deaths, more infections, more stress, and more loneliness. And the president had acknowledged that this virus has kept us apart. Months of discord about the coronavirus epidemic had transformed the cloth mask into a potent political symbol, touted by Democrats as a key part of communal responsibility, labeled by some GOP leaders as a sign of government overreach and as a scarlet letter pinned on the weak. While they were divided, a coronavirus ran free. When I was a child, I too spake as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away those childish things. Can I get an amen? This message was approved by Major Mike Webb. Honest. This has been a Filmways presentation, darling. And y'all come back now. Yeah.